Greetings, friends. My name is Jessa McLean, and I'm here to provide you with some blueprints of disruption. This weekly podcast is dedicated to amplifying the work of activists, examining power structures, and sharing the success stories from the grassroots. Through these discussions, we hope to provide folks with the tools and the inspiration they need to start to dismantle capitalism, decolonize our spaces, and bring about the political revolution we know we need. Welcome. Can you introduce yourself to the audience, please?
I'm Alex Kosh. I'm the managing editor of news at The Maple.
Now, I usually have guests on here, and I assume folks know exactly what The Maple is, but let's pretend that there's somebody listening that doesn't know yet. So what is The Maple, Alex?
Yeah, so The Maple is an independent, 100% reader-funded news publication that's dedicated to investigating stories that we think are heavily undercovered, and specifically stories that challenge the status quo in Canada. We were launched in 2021, originally just me as the sole editorial employee. And then we merged with our kind of sister publication, Passage, which became the opinion section of The Maple, and that's run by Davide Mastracci.
I didn't know that. It seems like you folks have just been around longer than that. It seems so established. If you folks check out The Maple's website, which is linked in the show notes, as we always do, I think you're going to notice a whole lot of stories on there that you are not seeing in legacy media. Things that we are definitely talking about. And if you've been listening, you know that we have heavily leaned on both Alex and Davide's material. I see you have other contributors as well that we've had on the show and we'll try to get on the show. Yeah, I think what really is drawing my attention right now that is very pertinent to our audience, which is primarily activists, organizers, shit disturbers that are looking to do the same thing, upend the status quo, is the time and energy that you folks have spent on unraveling the Canadian arms trade. And I'd like to talk about that, as well as some of the other material that is all just very related to kind of the way the state, the Canadian state and capital respond to the work that we're all doing. The pressure, the movements, particularly Palestinian solidarity movements right now. I saw you tweet just about an hour ago, again, that very few media outlets, aside from, Al Jazeera and La Presse, specifically Canadian media, has picked up on the story that you most recently published on the Quebec firm that has been contracted to make mortars for the state of Israel, or potentially. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And then maybe we can unpack why that's not a bigger story, because I think that's exactly what the audience will think when they hear this and they've seen the work to get an arms embargo and the promises made by the Liberals, and that this is kind of explosive in just its contradictions. Forget the fact that it's paired with contributing to a genocide, right? It is one of those political kind of bombs that I thought would have exploded a little bit more.
Yeah, when I was tipped off about this. So the United States recently authorized a $20 billion arms sale to Israel. So to be clear, this isn't military aid. This is private companies who are contracted to sell equipment to Israel. And within those press releases that US State Department released was mention of 50,000 mortar cartridges to be sold to Israel. And within that press release, it mentions the Quebec-based firm General Dynamics Ordnance and Tactical Systems, or GDOTS for short, as being the principal contractor in that aspect of the overall sale package or potential sale package. These goods haven't been sold yet, but they are expected to be sold to Israel by 2026. So the reason this was made public is because it exceeds the congressional threshold at which the State Department is required to notify Congress. However, they don't always name the military contractors, I don't think. I haven't followed US arms trades too closely, so I don't know how uncommon it is. But my understanding is that this is not always the case, that they name the principal contractor. So this was a little glimpse into the potential complicity of Canadian suppliers in providing arms and military equipment to Israel. And to be honest, when I first saw this, I didn't think I would be the first person to break this story, and I certainly didn't think I'd be among the only ones in Canada to break this story. We published it, I believe, last Tuesday, and it was followed up with a story, a really good story actually, from Al Jazeera, which got into the sort of the details of this, what's described as a loophole by arms monitoring groups. It's called a loophole because basically, while Canada, there are two main streams of arms exports to the world, I suppose, not just Israel. There are direct exports from Canadian companies straight to the end user country, but there are also those that go to the United States, which are largely unregulated. And the Al Jazeera article did a really good job, and I encourage people to go ahead and read that. It explains why that's the case, why Canada has this big gaping hole in its arms export regulations, and how these goods go through the United States onwards to countries like Israel.
That seems like an expertly designed loophole, though, not one that ended up by mistake. It seems all very convenient, but we've heard many times before how that isn't even the only way Canadian arms trade continues to Israel. The lethal versus non-lethal bullshit, and it's endless, as is the trades to Israel. It's seemingly, despite the pressure that's mounted from below, and like I said earlier, like the promises made inside the legislature, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of restraint in terms of curbing this arms sale, which is why I think it's so important that you folks press on. This isn't the first story that you have issued on the arms trade and the lack of fulfillment to those promises from the Liberals. But it is, I think, one of the more explosive ones. I'm glad you made that point, because I wrote down press release and underlined it. Why would they issue a press release about this? Like, are they trying to get someone in trouble? But you explained like it was kind of forced upon them, and I'm sure that made the Canadian government pretty uncomfortable. But so far, they seem to be able to skirt this issue. And I imagine even if we press them, they will point to that loophole as something that's uncontrollable, right? Have they commented on this loophole?
No, they promised me a statement earlier this week, and I still haven't heard anything. And I imagine they haven't felt the pressure to say anything precisely because major English language Canadian news outlets haven't followed up on this story and haven't also been pressing the Foreign Affairs Ministry for an answer on this. But it's to really sort of spell out why this is so explosive, because back in March, your listeners, I'm sure, will be aware that Parliament passed a non-binding motion to end arms and military goods exports to Israel. The Trudeau government later clarified that this would only apply to new export permits. And essentially what they said was that we'll delay approving new export permits. However, existing permits, which we now know could total about $95 million worth of goods, will still be allowed to go ahead. But crucially, all this time, despite even with those existing export permits and those that were authorized in the first 2 months after October 7th, the Trudeau government has repeatedly insisted that all goods going from Canada to Israel are for quote-unquote non-lethal goods. Now, as arms monitoring groups quickly pointed out at the time, this is a legally meaningless category. There's nothing in Canada's Export Control Act that specifies what is a non-lethal military good. And in fact, Global Affairs Canada has described as quote-unquote non-lethal items such as rifle scopes, laser rangefinders, goods that are absolutely essential to the operation of a deadly piece of military hardware, but in themselves don't deliver a killing blow.
A rifle?
Or a rifle scope.
Understood.
So it's like, you can aim at a target, but the scope itself won't. So it's bullshit, basically.
Guns don't kill people. People kill people.
Exactly. It's the same absurd logic there. But then this revelation from the US State Department, we're not talking, to be clear, like the manufacturer in Quebec isn't sending full mortar shells or mortar, it's cartridges. So it's a piece that's absolutely essential to the functioning of a deadly piece of equipment. But this really just kind of explodes the Trudeau government's narrative that all along it's been harmless goods that are flying. There's been absurd examples that Melanie Joly has floated in Parliament, saying things like, oh, well, it can include things like fire extinguishers and flak jackets, which, we now know is just complete nonsense. There are goods from Canadian suppliers going to Israel which can and very likely will be used to inflict harm and death.
Now, when we're talking about the craft of journalism. This seems like textbook things that journalists should be focusing on, should be covering, should be exposing, right? Like, this is the most basic possible example. Why is it that more Canadian platforms are not covering this at all? What's going on there from your analysis?
I was like, I'm sure you have a theory too, Santiago. We'll let Alex go first.
Yeah. No, it's an excellent question. And I'm sure there's not one specific reason. Like it could be self-censorship. It could be just like, we have evidence that there are news organizations in Canada that refrain from covering these types of issues because they just don't want to deal with the flack that they get from pro-Israel groups. Whether that's the case here, I don't know. I don't have any proof that is the case here. To be honest, I just think a lot of Canadian journalists at legacy outlets just don't care all that much about this issue, and that they're far more interested in things like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a dull, mundane political issue of the day, but they simply don't see this as worth their time or newsworthy. I've actually spoken to a journalist from the Globe and Mail back last year, right when the Trudeau government admitted that it had authorized new military export permits since October 7th. I was speaking to this journalist who told me that he didn't think it was newsworthy, which, I guess you don't want to be crowding out rewriting press releases from the Business Council of Canada about how we should be increasing military spending with this nonsense. But it's a myriad of reasons. It's self-censorship. It's pressure from the Israel lobby. It's journalists and legacy outlets who I think are just trained not to really sort of see what we see as important and pressing issues that need to be covered.
Since you brought it up, the Israeli lobby, whether or not they're responsible for the suppression directly or indirectly of some of these stories, I think some people don't appreciate just how big and pervasive they are in Canadian politics. I mean, like, they're understanding because of how it's playing out, but there's a whole bunch of motivating factors for Canada to be involved in this bullshit, right? Besides, they don't even need lobbyists. But, I mean, there is deep impact there. And you folks have done a few stories now at the Maple on the size and brashness of the lobbyists, just flouting any rules that are there. I'm sure they're not the only lobbyists, just kind of bypassing the rules that are there to curb their influence. Yeah, can you perhaps share some of that knowledge with us on just how much they're influencing the behavior of politicians?
Sure. Yeah, this is definitely something that my colleague Davide covers in a lot more detail. So I would just encourage people to go over and read these stories for themselves, because they really do go into just degrees of detail and analysis that is probably exceeds what I can do here. What I've looked at hasn't been so much about how they influence politicians, because unfortunately we don't know very much about what these conversations are behind the scenes. What we can see is how pro-Israel groups monitor media, because the pressure groups that try to influence this are actually very public and very open about how they do that.
CJ.
So what it looks like is some of these groups will organize mass email campaigns. They'll cite a story, they'll flag it to their many thousands of followers and say, okay, copy and paste this template email, or however they decide to do it on a given case.
We know the tactics. We use them too.
Exactly. And then so a news editor who, say, has just published a story that's remotely critical of Israel will suddenly be faced with hundreds of emails in their inbox. And to be brutally honest, 9 times out of 10, it isn't that news editors are afraid that, this Israel lobby group will get me fired, or that, we'll pull our sponsors or advertisers, although that definitely is a risk, and it's definitely part of their thinking, no doubt. But so much of the time, it's literally just like they just can't be bothered to deal with it because it's a headache. And, they're already probably dealing with 1,000,001 other tasks, because newsrooms are so cash strapped and starved at the moment that it's like, well, I just don't want to have to deal with this this nuisance, frankly. And it works, and it does cause journalists to self-censor, to avoid covering these kinds of really important stories.
Yeah, I had one of those happen to one of my op-eds on us, reporting Canada wrote an article attacking my op-ed, and then luckily my editor just kind of laughed it off and was like, whatever, and we just went from there. But
well, I'm kind of mad we haven't been flagged by those fuckers yet. I mean, someone share an episode with them.
Yeah, they don't bother with they don't bother with the podcast, but they attacked Humber News like 3 times in the last 6 months. So
that is a great point that you raised, Jessa. That they haven't gone after these kinds of groups haven't gone after us either, and I think it's because they know they can't really. We are the people who run the organization. They can't go over our heads, and
we have no boss.
Exactly. Yeah. And I also think it's like they're overwhelmingly focused on legacy media outlets. And I actually think, to their peril, to be quite honest, because we're circumventing these legacy outlets with our own original reporting, and people are reading this stuff, and it's being followed up in Parliament, in major outlets as well. Sometimes, not all the time, because we just gave an example. But you know what I mean? It's like, I think that they are very much preoccupied with, the Post medias, the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, that kind of thing.
And apparently student journalists for some reason.
Yes.
Let's talk about that peril that we put them in, right? The movement here in Canada to disarm Israel, right? It's essentially hand in hand with the ceasefire movement, the Palestinian solidarity movement, whatever. There's a lot of nuance there, but the pressure point and how we feel Canada can play a role in ending the genocide and the occupation is at the arms trade, right? That's the pressure point that almost all have chosen. Weapons manufacturers are the target across the globe. And if it wasn't for reporting like this, we wouldn't have the tools necessary to continue. This is the greatest example, because if everybody just took the statements from the Liberal Party as true, I know a lot of people take everything the government says with a grain of salt, but, they promised essentially to the layman there would be an arms embargo. And if no one had done the digging, there would be no grounds, right, for the movement to persist. Right? It'd be like, what are you talking about? You already got what you wanted. Move on. But that was all smoke and mirrors. And maybe you can touch on that role that you folks play at the Maple in highlighting those stories that aren't just untold stories, but they're very pivotal to the work that is being done on the ground by activists and organizers.
And this is actually why I was more surprised that legacy outlets didn't follow up on the mortar cartridges story, because if nothing else, even if you're a legacy outlet that doesn't particularly care about the genocide going on in Gaza, at the very least it highlights the Trudeau government has brazenly lied through its teeth, which I would think more outlets would be interested in. Because the Trudeau, there's video that was shared by World Beyond War recently of Justin Trudeau directly saying to a protester, a member of the public, saying, "We've stopped arms exports to Israel." This is just a brazen lie. And whether it's because, and I do think there's an element, Canada's arms export system is quite complicated. And you do wonder sometimes whether Trudeau and Melanie Joly simply are just not informed about this and just too dumb to understand the nuances of it. But I think it's much more likely that they are fully aware and they are actually quite happily lying about this. But as for the role we play, I mean, it's really just to kind of highlight the truth behind these political narratives and how they are constructed. Another story we did recently was that back in February, we got arms export data released by Global Affairs Canada, and it showed the Trudeau government had authorized $28.5 million worth of military export permits in the first 2 months of Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza. And I filed a follow-up request to see, how they assembled this data package. And what we found was that political staff from Melanie Joly's office had basically tried to meddle with the ATIP disclosure process, which, to be clear, should be completely removed from political staff. And they tried to insert a paragraph basically saying all of these exports are for quote-unquote non-lethal goods. So in other words, they wanted to insert the government's political spin into a disclosure package. And luckily, ATIP staff over at GAC said, no, you can't do that. That's highly inappropriate. So what we and activists on the ground are trying to do are, is basically just highlight that this is still very much an ongoing issue, that things aren't as the Trudeau government has made them out to be. and to really just kind of keep people informed as to what's really going on. And I would hope accordingly take everything the Trudeau government says about this issue with a huge grain of salt and a high degree of skepticism.
Skepticism, yes, but without the receipts, sometimes you just sound like a conspiracy nut, right? And and like you mentioned, the complexities of some of these trades, and we talked at the beginning of these loopholes that most people would have no idea about. It makes it very, very difficult for the average person to hold their government accountable. What kind of reach are you folks getting over at the Maple? Because it's heartening to when you said you feel your impact. That makes me happy, because it's hard to see sometimes when you're flooded with legacy media, and it's you have to kind of go looking for Canadian independent media now. I mean, my feed is full of it, but perhaps not everybody else. So has it been difficult for you, especially with the changes made to social media when it comes to Canadian media content and having to rethink the wheel?
Yeah, we've definitely had, the Google or the Meta blackout as a result of the Trudeau government's legislation. That did impact us for sure. But in terms of how we reach people on, some of these important issues, people notice if the information is important enough, even with the kind of media blackout we've seen in the most recent story, it gets mentioned in Parliament. We've been cited by name in Parliament. We've been cited by name in international media, in Al Jazeera and BBC News. I think at a certain point it does become a bit difficult, or if not impossible, to completely whitewash all this information. But yeah, there's no question, like any other outlet, we've been trying to navigate this issue, and we're still figuring out ways to do that. Luckily, the primary way that we connect with our readers is through an emailed newsletter, which means, our subscribers are getting this stuff just straight to their inbox and are, reading it.
And then hopefully sharing it.
Yeah, well, but then of course they can't share it on Facebook or Instagram, which has been an issue. But, there are other ways to get this information out there. Unfortunately, we do still have to use the website formerly known as Twitter, despite its complete clown of an owner. But it's an ever shifting goalpost. I think that was your phrase, right? Even if we figure out a way to navigate this issue, we just know on the horizon there's going to be something else that kind of is thrown at us, and we just have to constantly be on our feet to think about ways to get around that. But the email newsletter format we have found has actually been quite useful just for being able to connect with people directly. And of course, it also means we get direct feedback from our readers, because they can just simply reply to the email. And we always like to hear from of course we get, like any other publication, we get the hate mail that you would expect from people who are very hostile to what we're about. But of course we also just get
who's sending them the newsletter though?
Well, that's the thing. I often wonder why these people they have to actively sign up to get on our mailing list. And I guess it's just people like to be angry and to rage read, I suppose, which each to their own, I guess. But more in a more positive way, we get some really valuable insights from our readers. People have every time I do a story based on a ATIP release package, like government documents, I include it in the story itself so that readers can go and look at it for themselves. And we've actually had cases where readers have said, "Oh, did you think about this as well?" And it's allowed me to follow up on even more details. So we really like to have that kind of close and direct relationship with our readership.
Complete side note, I saw that Aliyah Pabani was a recent guest, and she had signed up for the National Post's Israel newsletter. No one knows who's writing it, but she didn't actually receive it. But I imagine that was for a bit of a rage read. So I get that. And also when you talk about having to shift tactics, that's something we talk about a lot on the show, because the state is forever shifting their tactics on suppression and whatnot. Now, and you've done a lot of coverage watching Canadian government figures react to both the Israeli lobby and the Palestinian solidarity movement. Has it changed their behavior at all? I know it hasn't changed policy a whole lot, not materially, but do you find, that FOI requests are harder to get filled? Are there any kind of shifts there that you could warn us about, where your job is perhaps getting more difficult, because I imagine you have pressed the government since, at least 2021, the Maple's been going after information that folks would rather we not have. Has that task changed, or your interactions with politicians changed?
It's a good question. As far as like FOI or ATIP requests go, it's, there are oversights and they are fulfilled by civil servants who are supposed to be impartial and not influenced by political staff in any way. So irregardless of whether, the minister's office would rather we didn't get something, it's not, by law, it's not their call to make, although, of course, we've seen cases where they've tried to meddle and interfere with the process. So this accounts for why we still are able to get some like quite damning information through these kinds of requests that, clearly the government would rather we didn't know about. But in terms of interactions with staff themselves, I mean, it's hard to say really. Like it's, you do sense impatience and hostility sometimes with political comms staff, who are the sort of main point of contact that we have. But, it really is just like that's all the Trudeau government has at this point on this issue is really just a comms strategy, because they've shown themselves to be unwilling to substantively change the way Canada relates to Israel and the rest of the kind of American empire. But what they do have is an ability to sort of like triangulate their messaging to try and please all camps. But what I think is like different here is that like, part of it is our reporting and reporting and research of other groups like, Project Plowshares and World Beyond War and CJPME, who've like exposed really damning information about the government's conduct on this file. But I mean, to be brutally honest, I just think Israel's conduct has just been so abhorrent and impossible to ignore. Like it
a comms nightmare.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, it's not as easy as it was in 2005 to just say like, I stand with Israel, I support Israel's right to self-defense. When we're seeing these just daily videos, we're seeing Israeli ministers go out and defend rapists quite openly. It's a rogue state by any other definition. So like, I think the comm strategy is sort of just like cracking under the sheer weight of evidence that we just have available to us now.
Which makes it really hard to understand the Liberal Party pulling out of Ottawa's Pride Parade because of their pretty tepid statement of Palestinian solidarity. And that's not to undermine people who fought to have that statement made. And do you think the Liberals are doing that a good job at managing their comms? Can we maybe try to look to the future on how this is going to play out politically, and the Liberals' kind of inability to suppress all of these stories and manage just such a horrible onslaught of information that, that they just can't, like you say, contradict?
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly not working, right? Like they have like the most overtly pro-Zionist MPs in their caucus who are very clearly unhappy. They have loud Israel voices, like acting as if the Trudeau government's meaningfully changed the way Canada relates to Israel. I often think some of these people should show a little more gratitude, honestly, to how craven and obedient the Trudeau government has been to Israeli interests. But at the same time, none of us are being duped. No one in the Palestine Solidarity movement is being duped by these kinds of like very farcical lines that they've been putting out about the arms trade. I mean, I would say that maybe they've been somewhat successful in the arms file because they have successfully created this mirage of being like, yeah, we've halted arms sales. They won a comms victory when they passed that non-binding motion, and I think successfully, unfortunately, deceived quite a lot of people that things had meaningfully changed. Hopefully that's now changing with these new revelations. So that's maybe one area where they were able to kind of like quieten down the issue, at least, if not make it go away completely. But I mean, in terms of like holding together their broader coalition, because they the Liberal Party does encompass elements of both camps, but clearly it's failing, right? Like, no one is happy with how the Liberal government's handling this.
And that's the case with all politicians, progressive politicians at the moment, right? They have not done enough to appease their leftist base, and they surely haven't been centrist enough or walked that line tight enough to please the Zionists either. Olivia Chow's one a great example. The entire NDP, especially the Ontario NDP, are an example. It seems like no matter what they do, they are not gaining points here.
Yeah, and I mean that's what I'd say to these politicians. It's like no matter what, you're never going to please the pro-Israel like groups and lobbyists unless you're like completely all in supporting anything and everything the Israel government does. So why not at least stand on the right side of history? If you're going to incur their wrath anyway, like you might as well like take a moral and principled stand. I really struggle to understand this because it's clearly impossible to appease pro-Israel forces if unless you're absolutely all in with everything they do.
Yeah, like how would you make a house father happy? Like at what level would the Liberal government have to operate to make that man happy? And sometimes I wonder that discontent that seems to be coming from within is just, another ploy to just try to please both sides or appeal to both sides and make it seem like they're doing something that they're not. But that is good advice, Alex. But I think you can give them that advice on so many issues where they're just playing short-term goals or, they're testing the waters before they speak. And it's not really on morals or values. That seems to sum up a lot of our problems with a lot of things. But Pierre Poilievre doesn't mince words. He is not playing both sides or even trying to appease, obviously, any kind of leftist base. The language around this issue and the possible policy changes. I mean, do you think there'd be a substantive difference under a conservative government, specifically as it relates to the foreign policy with Israel and how it would respond to the solidarity movement?
It's a really important question. It's one myself and my colleague Jeremy Appel explored in some detail a couple of months ago. We are facing a very likely possibility of a Pierre Poilievre government when the next election rolls around. And so it's important to start considering what that might look like, especially on this issue, but obviously every other issue too. And the answer is I actually think it would probably be substantively worse in several ways. And I think we only have to look back to how the Harper government conducted itself on this file, just being extremely aggressively pro-Israel, voting against almost every UN motion that dared utter the name of Palestinian rights. I think there'd be a much more heavy-handed clamping down on the Palestine solidarity movement, although, of course, we have seen that under the Trudeau government. But I think there's every reason to suspect that it would probably go into overdrive under a conservative administration. I think there's no doubt it would be worse and more aggressive. We'd have to be very concerned, I think, about how Canada's role would shift to an even more belligerent one in the region as a whole. Like I think Canada would potentially be an aggravating small middle power in escalating conflict with Iran, with Hezbollah. I think it would be a disaster.
Sometimes it's hard to imagine how we could have worse foreign policy, but I'm so glad that you shared those possibilities with us, because I know we do talk a lot about all politicians essentially all being the same, but yeah, there definitely are some substantive differences with the Conservatives. That is going to make for an interesting election. Do you think this will play out in the campaign itself, or are they going to try to pretend it's not happening while they're stumping out there? Because that'll be impossible. Every single stop, this is going to be such a messy election, should there be one, while this is ongoing, because they can't even go out to dinner, let alone announce campaign stops everywhere. So, I'm looking forward to harassing them. But do you think the media will allow it to play a role in the elections?
I think it'll depend in large part where the war is at that point. So we're about a year away from the next election. And, has it escalated by that point? Are we in a fully fledged proxy war with Iran? If that's the case, then I think it will probably be impossible to ignore. But I still think it won't be a leading... sadly, I sort of doubt it will be a leading national issue. It might be really important in certain individual ridings where there are large communities who, lean one way or the other on the issue. So it might be a difference of a handful of MPs. I don't know. I'm really bad at electoral analysis and calculations, but that would be my feeling. Just given now how brazenly we've seen Israel doing what it's doing now, and it's barely registering as a national issue. It's hard for me to imagine this being a pivotal issue at the level of a federal election, unfortunately.
Yeah, it is unfortunate because I think it's not just that single voter issue, like we're seeing it played when you talk about the elections to the South, where folks are being accused of sabotaging the entire democracy by bringing up the fact that Kamala has participated in this herself, and all the other things that you could list off that are problematic with that candidate. And it's not just a single issue. Forget the fact that it's a genocide, that has to be stopped, that we're not inundated with all of these images. But it's telling you exactly where these powers that be will stand on all our forms of resistance. When you see how they're treating protesters outside of the DNC or throughout the United States, obviously we're seeing that here. The idea that it could worsen under conservatives is kind of terrifying, but it's just that inability to force our progressive politicians to the right side of history, like you described it. It's because they have faced incredible pressure, all of them, and the NDP has shifted in language, but that's kind of an easy shift for them to make where they politically stand right now as fourth party. It wasn't all that risky. It came really late, and it's kind of weak to begin. Like we don't have to unpack that, but it's just, I think it's demonstrating to people, these candidates, what they will do when you try to really challenge them on anything, and how immovable they seem on certain things that are of the utmost importance. So yeah, it's very frustrating that these stories don't gain more traction so that people are more informed, but it's also heartbreaking to think that people look at this as a side issue.
Yeah, and like I mentioned Polyev earlier, and how things would almost certainly be worse, not just on the question of Palestine, but a whole range of other issues as well. And this is the constant thing that's invoked. Like I remember in the 2019 election, it was the climate election. Every time you spoke about the Liberals' failures on that file, of course, it was invoked. Well, take a look at what the Conservatives will do, and it's used to cajole people into maintaining just a completely untenable and unacceptable status quo. It's the constant thing we are facing in media and in activist spaces. I will say, I think the NDP, I'm very cynical about the NDP. But I think, I have to hand it to Heather McPherson, on the issue of arms exports to Israel, that specific item. She's really been pushing hard on that, and has really been a useful voice to keep this issue, even though it's not unfortunately a central, constant news cycle national issue. I think she's played an important role in keeping the issue alive. So I think some credit is due there. But yeah, on the whole, we're facing a really, unfortunately, a difficult time in keeping this on people's radars, especially when you can so easily invoke the bogeyman of and it is a real bogeyman, let's be clear. The Conservatives... You
just described it, right?
The Conservatives are a very grim prospect. But yeah, I also don't think people should allow themselves to be bullied into voting for something that's just unacceptable just because of that.
Well, and also to ask people to suppress this, knowing how the news cycle works, right? When Palestinian solidarity activists have worked so hard day and night for 10 months now to keep this in the news cycle, to do drastic things, disruptions, so that we will keep talking about it, because the images are daily. So the news is not reporting on these daily images until they are so absolutely atrocious and they go viral and whatnot. But, to ask them to not talk about it until after November, or should there be a Canadian election or the by-elections, to kind of, don't spoil the vote by bringing up a genocide, is to essentially ask them to dissolve their movement for a few months and pretend like it's not happening, because maybe they'll thwart off some really ugly policy changes that'll make their job harder.
And it really is gaslighting to expect people to the people to change, rather than the parties to be better on the issues.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's always on the shoulders of people who are supposed to be driving policy and democracies and election. It's gaslighting is exactly the right term.
I don't want you to play armchair quarterback, because I think we're all kind of hyper aware of, what would I do kind of approaches. But knowing what you know and what you've worked on, I'm not going to say in the last 10 month, just period. Do you have any advice for folks building movements when it comes to staying atop of the news cycle, or perhaps finding pressure points that are media related or media assisted? You know, for example, we had somebody on here where you talked about being mentioned in the legislature, and the author was like, I should have sent it to a couple MPs or MPPs. Like, I should have really fed this to somebody who was working on it and whatnot. It was like a tip, you know, for folks on how to stay relevant and manage media, I suppose. But
I actually think the movement as it is right now has done a really decent job of this, and to be honest, I kind of take a lot of cues from them in a lot of instances. So yeah, I mean, and what they've been doing is like, yeah, just maintaining contact with people in Parliament and identifying those who are sympathetic to the cause, keeping the information up to date constantly, and really effectively debunking the lies that have been told. Like, it was World Beyond War who highlighted Justin Trudeau lying through his teeth, saying that we've like halted arms exports to Israel, and kind of drawing attention to that fact. So, and I think the directness of the language is important, like calling it a lie as you see it. Like, you know, there's a tendency in a lot of like media outlets, especially, to sort of say like false claim, or, you know,
misinformation is my favorite one.
Disinformation. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's just a lie. You can call it that. Like, it's
as long as you're not in the legislature.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you get kicked out if you say
it's
that.
It's up to us, people.
Exactly.
I understand you giving folks like Heather McPherson credit for what they do in the legislature, but, you know, for me, that those are just words in that room. There needs to be actions behind them, and when they're not, you almost know that they're just words. Yeah, I think World Beyond War is like, just, they've got their teeth into this issue, and they're going to shake it until something comes loose. Like, it's not, they're not allowing people to move the goalposts on them so much, you know. It's, we are going to hold it here. We're not going to be distracted by the claims of anti-Semitism or the claims that spoiling the vote and all of that. You know, it's just eyes on target, keep at it, and, you know, finding ways to blow it up over and over again. So I imagine, and I've seen, I'm not just imagining, if you go on the IG or the Instagram pages of a lot of these organizations, so World Beyond War is one of them, but they're not the only one. I mean, the Palestinian solidarity groups, like, there's local ones, there's national ones. They have been blowing up your story.
Totally.
They're not only sharing your work, which is important, but they're using the information you've provided them to create their own shareables and highlight this constant battle to stop the arms to Israel. And so that's like a free asset you've provided a lot of people, which we really do appreciate. You mentioned being reader supported. Do you believe like that is what allows you to tell these stories that normally people that wouldn't surface?
It's definitely a big part of it, because, you know, the crucial element, it means that like we can afford to upset some people. Like, we don't have like one donor who's paying, you know, our salaries, for example, so that we have to be terrified of losing. It also means that like we're accountable to like a much larger pool of people. Like, it means that like there's not like sponsors or donors that like people can go after and try and sort of hive off of our organization. It means, yeah, it affords obviously a lot of editorial freedom for sure. But, you know, there are other news outlets out there that like are funded in a slightly different way that still do really fantastic and important work. Like, obviously the Breach has done really important stories on this file as well. And they have a slightly different model to ours. But, you know, we all make it work in our own way, and we all are able to do this work one way or the other.
You got to make it work, right? With whatever you got. Did you notice an uptake in your readership when Canada Land imploded under Jesse Brown's escalating genocidal tendencies? Like, what is going we don't have to talk about Canada Land, but I imagine folks were looking for alternate sources around then, and I saw folks pointing them towards Narwhal or Maple or The Breach The Orchard, Jeremy. Like, we'll link folks to all of the stories that we've mentioned here so you can give some love to the independent media that really fuels a lot of the work that we do. I wanted to take a second and ask you, but I don't know if you'll be able to. We might have to edit this out. Davide keeps teasing his audience with a story that's been percolating for some time. Even saying, he hasn't been able to publish in a while. We've been starved of his stories because he's been working on something. Do you want to tease our audience a little bit, or are you not allowed?
Unfortunately, I can because there's just a few sourcing things we still have to sort out and make sure everything's fully on board. I don't want to promise something that we might not actually be able to deliver. So yeah, unfortunately I can't.
Okay, well, we'll leave it in anyway because you're just all enticed now to make sure you subscribe to the Maple if you haven't already, because you just don't know what might drop.
When it comes to, working in, media, journalism, is I guess, like, we're talking about some of the failures of like mainstream media to cover things, right? And obviously, like, with platforms like the Maple, you're trying to expose all of these truths, right, that aren't getting exposed. But I've been wondering, I guess, about the importance of truth lately, because it doesn't seem to matter much whether or not something is true or not. It just matters how something is spun. So I guess my question is about like putting in all of this effort to try and find the truths. What do you see the value behind that as being?
That's a great question. I mean, the immediate term value, I hope, is that it sort of forces the government to remain on the defensive and to keep adjusting its narrative accordingly until it's untenable to do so, and that they're actually forced to do something to save face. But kind of more largely, I hope it just serves as a historical record. If nothing, ideally you want to stop the genocide happening right now, but realistically the government doesn't show any sign of actually wanting to end Canada's complicity in that. So at the very least, like, I hope it just remains part of the record, and that people look back on this time and see what was really going on, despite the constant lies that we've just been fed this whole time.
That's a good way of putting it, I think, because it can be very frustrating where there's so much work that goes into trying to fight a narrative only for absolute nonsense to seem to dominate what people actually take from anything, right?
And what people will believe.
We live in such a moment, in such a distorted moment, with just such I guess what really sparked it was like we over the last few weeks we've seen like a lot of historical moments happen back to back, and just like the immediate narrative that you see in the public has very little to do with any facts at all, right? And just like I guess I've been reflecting on because I went to journalism school, and I've been reflecting on kind of what I want to do now that I'm done that. And there's a certain cynicism of like, I guess, how just seeing the response to everything. There's a cynicism of like, is this effort all wasted just for the truth not to even matter anyways?
Yeah, no, I feel that a lot. It is like pretty like sad and demoralizing sometimes when you know this information and you put it out there and like yet nothing changes. It can be frustrating, and it can be immiserating as well. But yeah, I mean, I just hope there's like a way we can have an impact in the longer term at the very least, and that the story of this genocide is told in a correct way, at least in some point in the future, if not right now.
That makes me mad, though. That makes me mad. And that's such a heavy fucking burden, too. But, we're all willing to do. But the historical record comment is what I'm stuck on, That hurts to think that's its only impact. So I assure you it's not. Because, like, whether you're getting mentioned in the legislature or whether, it's shared thousands of times or tens of thousands of times, the impacts are real. They're measurable in individuals reading them, right? They go out into the world better informed. Like, they didn't just absorb it and it's in their head, right? It manifests itself in all kinds of ways. Not the powerful. I don't give a fuck if they're listening. They know. They already know. But it's like the readers, the listeners that get it, that have more ammo, that have validating receipts of things they pretty much knew were happening already. They have the ability now to present this to the people around them that are swayable. All right. And they go into doing the work that we talk about daily here of organizing and building connections, but with a better understanding. The impact is always immediate upon reading. You can't see it though, right? Like, you might get an email back and and those feel good. Like, every time we get a message in our DMs or whatever, and it's like, I love when they talk about a specific episode, where I didn't know that, thank you for sharing that. Like, that will that drives me for like a week. Like, I really get boosts. So you have to know that those are just the people who bothered to email you or DM you or even knew how, right? Like, I know they can just reply to your newsletter, but you know what I mean? Like,
totally, yeah.
That is happening over and over and over again. And so the facts matter.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just don't want anyone to lose heart, right? Because the work that Santiago does and Alex and his comrades at the Maple, it fucking matters. Even if you don't see it play out in politics, it matters. It matters. You make sure you support these folks. I want to thank Alex and the people at the Maple for doing what you do. Like, if I were to put a list at the bottom of this episode of all of the times we've referenced your work, it would be a huge chunk of our content, right? Like, we were really excited to get you on here and to hear your point of view and share the Maple with our viewers, just in case they didn't know who you were, but I think they did. So thank you, Alex.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you for having me on, and I'm glad our work is useful for you guys to share out there, and thank you for doing that. We appreciate it a lot.
Thank you.
That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. Also, a very big thank you to the producer of our show, Santiago Halu Quintero. Blueprints of Disruption is an independent production operated cooperatively. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content, and if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.